This is a scoping presentation for the Vision Blueprint Recreational Regulatory Amendment 26. This is an amendment to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan of the South Atlantic region. So right now we're at the scoping stage of this amendment. So this is very early on in the process. You can see the arrow pointing right there to the scoping portion of the process, which this presentation will provide background information, reasons for why the Council is considering changing regulations, and I'm going to tell you how to submit comments and by when. Scoping is an opportunity for members of the public to make suggestions before the Council has made any decision. So we are here to propose to you things that might be considered, and it's a good time for the public to give the Council their opinion. So first off, a little bit of background. The 2016 through 2020 Vision Blueprint for the Snapper Grouper fishery is the long-term strategic plan for managing that fishery. The Council began developing this strategic plan in 2012 through the Visioning Project, which included lots of outreach to stakeholders throughout the region and for all the sectors, commercial and recreational. Then during 2015, the Council prioritized action items that could be addressed through amendments to the Snapper Grouper Fishery Management Plan over the next 5 years. So right now, the Council is considering several items for inclusion in this amendment, and as I mentioned, this is a recreational amendment. So they're looking at taking another look at the aggregate bag limits, reevaluating the current shallow water grouper closure, talking about modifying the minimum size limit for black sea bass, and removing recreational minimum size limits for deepwater species. I should also mention that additional items from that Vision Blueprint are being considered in Amendment 43. That's an amendment that is also going to be going through the scoping process, and it addresses red snapper management and recreational reporting. So to start off, the recreational aggregate bag limits. Right now on your screen you have the current snapper bag limit, which is 10 per person per day, and it includes the species you see on your screen. Of course, it does not include red snapper. Harvest for red snapper has been closed to both commercial and recreational harvest for some time. And also there is currently an amendment that would modify the mutton snapper aggregate and lower that to 5 per person within the 10 snapper aggregate. That's in the works. It's not been implemented yet. There is also an aggregate grouper bag limit, which is 3 per person per day, but there's a lot of exceptions. So gag and black, there can only be 1, but not both, per person per day. For snowy grouper, the maximum allowed is 1 per vessel per day, and harvest is only allowed May through August. Then for blue line tilefish, there's also a season, May through August only. And for golden tilefish, again, a maximum of 1 per person per day. And also, as you can see, this aggregate grouper limit includes the shallow water groupers as well as some deep water species. There is also an aggregate for species that don't have a bag limit, and that's an aggregate of 20 fish per person per day. And it includes the species on your screen, the porgies, gray triggerfish, barjack, almaco, banded rudderfish, lesser amberjack, white grunt, margate, sailor's choice, and spadefish. So how should the Council consider modifying these aggregate limits, and how should they be changed? So one option is to look at the deep water species and create an aggregate for those. So establish a certain number of fish, aggregate bag limit for the deep water species. If so, how many fish? Currently, the restrictions that are in place for some of those deep water species would need to remain in place because they were designed to result in a certain % reduction in harvest that was needed for those species in particular. There's also an option to perhaps allow harvest only May through August, like is currently the case for blue line tilefish and snowy grouper. And are there any other things that council should consider when it comes to modifying these aggregate bag limits? So for shallow water groupers, there could also be an aggregate for them, and those are listed on your screen. Should there be an aggregate, and if so, how many fish in that aggregate? Should there be other considerations for perhaps a shallow water grouper aggregate? There's also an option that's been considered to modify the 20 fish aggregate to also include the species that are in the current 10 snapper aggregate. So those are all listed on your screen, and the ones that are in italics are deepwater species. Should the council keep the number at 20 or reduce that number? And should there be other considerations? For example, should there be individual bag limits within this aggregate for certain species? There's been a recommendation from the Snapper Grouper Advisory Panel that the bag limit for gray triggerfish be reduced to 10 to 15. There's also been discussion about perhaps implementing a bag limit for the jacks complex, which includes almaco, banded rudderfish, and lesser amberjack. There's interest in the council's interested in getting input on whether there should be an individual bag limit for spadefish. Also, right now, the current bag limit for vermilion is 5 per person per day in addition to the 10 snapper aggregate. Should vermilion be included in the aggregate? So here, these are just some options of what the council has heard. Perhaps stakeholders would like to see the regulations changed. So moving on, the next item is a shallow water grouper closure. So right now, the possession of shallow water groupers for both commercial and recreational is prohibited January through April. And this was established in 2009 because there were some needed modifications to end overfishing of gag and to also protect spawning fish. So this shallow water grouper closure was put in place prior to implementation of the annual catch limits, or ACLs. So avoiding overfishing of gag is now achieved with the ACLs, but there is still that protection there for the spawning individuals. So in particular, the council has requested input on red grouper and scamp. And the reason is there is some concern over the status of these two species. They are on the list to be assessed, but they haven't been yet. And also we have heard that the current closure is not lining up very well in some areas when these fish are in spawning conditions. So in particular, keep in mind, these are two species the council is looking for input from you on. So here are just some options for what could be done. The shallow water grouper closure could be retained as is from January 1st through April 30th, but then perhaps some species should be excluded. If so, which ones? There could be a prohibition the same way that it is, but it could be adjusted by area. And this is responding to some ideas that we heard from stakeholders about perhaps having these rolling spawning closures. So what you see on your screen is simply for example to show how it would work. So for example, there could be a closure starting in January in East Florida and then move up the coast over time. That is an option. When the council was looking at doing specific management for South Florida species, they heard some input from folks that thought perhaps south of 28 degrees north latitude or maybe south of 31 degrees north latitude, there could be specific modifications to the shallow water grouper closure. So, you know, people realize that Florida, you know, these species have special needs in that area. So should there be some modifications for all the shallow water grouper species off of East Florida? Some ideas were to maybe exclude black grouper from the current closure and have a different one. Maybe exclude gag and establish a different seasonal closure for them. or exclude red grouper and scamp, and also have a different seasonal closure. So there's, in the scoping document that is accompanying this presentation, all of those alternatives are a little bit more spelled out, so you can look at those. There's several of them, and that's why I didn't put them in this presentation. But these are all things that have been brought to the council from stakeholders. And also, if there's any other things that the council should consider regarding the shallow water grouper closure, that's input that they are seeking at this time. And then removing the size limit for deep water species is another thing that they would like to accomplish. There are 3 species that are currently included in the Deepwater complex: silk snapper, queen snapper, and black fin snapper, and they all have a 12-inch total length minimum size limit. The problem is that these species are in deep water and they're typically associated with high discard mortality, so having minimum size limits creates a lot of discards. And then to address that, the council is proposing removing those, and they would like to know if you think these size limits should be removed. Oh, and I should mention that that action is also being considered for the commercial sector. And then finally, the last thing they're considering in this amendment is to perhaps modify the minimum size limit for black sea bass. Currently, the minimum size limit for recreational in the South Atlantic is 13 inches total length south of Cape Hatteras. The problem here is that black sea bass, we have found out, are being discarded primarily due to the size limit. The council recently took action through Regulatory Amendment 25 to increase the bag limit of black sea bass. During development of that amendment, the analyses show that about 92% of the black sea bass that are caught on recreational trips in our area are being discarded due to being undersized. So the council would like to know, should the minimum size limit be changed, and if so, how? So the options on your screen would have a reduction to 12 inches or perhaps 11 inches, which is the current commercial minimum size limit. Are there other options the council should consider for black sea bass? So timing for this amendment, as I mentioned early, this is a scoping, the scoping stage. So through January and February, we'll be conducting scoping hearings and getting input from stakeholders. The council will review those comments and revise the actions and alternatives at their meeting in March. They will review whatever analysis we have been able to complete and approve for public hearings in June. We would hold those hearings in August, review the public hearing comments in September, and we would get the council to approve for secretarial review in December of this year. So this is sort of just a rough timeline of what's coming up. And then here is the information that you would need to submit your comments. The council is using an online public comment form that is available from our website, and you can see that link on your screen. You can always mail your comments to the address that is on the scoping document. You can fax them to the number of your screen. We're requesting that comments be submitted by 5 o'clock on February the 10th. And my name is Myra Brower. I'm happy to answer any questions. You can call me at the number of your screen or use my email. And thank you for your time.